Good morning, Juan Carlos. Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you with us as part of our series on preventing violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the information of the viewers, my name is Etiony Aldarondo. I'm the Executive Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment. Today we have with us Mr. Juan Carlos Areán, Program Director at Futures Without Violence, and an international expert on programs and interventions with abusive partners. Juan Carlos recently published an article titled "The Other Side of Domestic Violence, Helping Survivors by Working with Their Abusive Partners, an approach to preventing violence that can work and even during a pandemic." He did it with Dr. Terry Strothoff in Milwaukee. So let's get to it. Juan Carlos, what motivated you to put this piece out and go?
Okay, Etienne. Well, greetings to everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So we all know we are under circumstances that we have never seen before. And in every chapter of our lives, we have had to adjust to new realities in ways that hasn't been done before. And that's true in the realm of domestic violence. You probably have heard at Etiony, there's different kinds of measurements, but in general, internationally, there's a sense that domestic violence is augmenting during this period, which makes sense because if there's already coercive control in a family, if you add to it all the stresses that come with a lockdown, being all together in one space, people getting unemployed, maybe having to homeschool your kids, even for people where there's no violence, that's very stressful, right? And even though these are not causes for violence, these kinds of stresses can make things worse for sure. Use of drugs and alcohol, that has gone up too. So all of this has been documented in different ways. So here we are, some of us like you and I, Etiony, have worked in this field for decades, right? For me, it's almost 30 years, trying to figure out how to work with people, mainly men. It could be women and people of all genders, but mainly men who use violence. How to work with them in a way that we can motivate them for real change and transformation and healing, a word that we don't use very often in this field, right? And some of us, and interestingly enough, I think was at least the beginning mainly people of color, Latinos, African American folks, because we, I think, knew that our men were not dispensable, and that there are consequences with people of color being involved with the criminal justice system, right, which is disproportionately punitive towards people and men of color in particular. I think because of that, some practitioners like you, like many friends, Fernando, Ricardo Carrillo, Jerry Tello, Oliver Williams, and many more that you know, I'm sorry not to be able to mention here, have developed really strategies that go outside the traditional criminal justice system to work with men who use violence. For viewers that don't know this, the majority of programs here in the United States have used traditionally the criminal justice system, the courts, and also child protection to a lesser degree to basically coerce men to go into the programs. Once they are in the programs, some programs have been very good at engaging men and motivating them to change. But that idea of that you need some system to mandate men to these programs this idea that this is necessary is very central to how we operate these programs in the US, right? So here we are now finding ourselves in a situation where those systems are not working as usual, right? The courts are barely working, skeleton staff. They do some things like restraining orders and certain things. Child welfare are also working at a minimum capacity. So all of a sudden, programs that work with men who use violence find themselves in a conundrum that, okay, we don't have those systems anymore. So how do we work with this man? And the interesting thing is that, as I said before, some of us have been thinking for many years about that in addition to this accountability system, or what I call systemic accountability, there's another system or approach which is relational. And it's not one or the other. Both of them have to work together, right? And some programs, like my co-author in the article, Terry Strathoff, has a program that has operationalized this relational accountability very well. It's basically using the power of connection, of human connection with someone else, to motivate them to change, in addition to whatever systems are out there, right? So what I have found fascinating, Etiony, about this time is that all of a sudden we find ourselves with minimal systems, formal systems, to work with people who use violence. Many programs just really didn't know how to proceed. Some of them went to this medium, like video conferencing, and many of them started offering groups both for free and making them optional. In other words, because of issues of equity, I think, and not everybody has access to good internet or to a computer or video or so on. Many of these programs said, okay, we'll hold the groups, they'll be open, they'll be free, at least to start with, and you will not be penalized if you don't come to the group, right? They told that to the participants. So in fact, it became a voluntary group because there was no consequence for not coming. And the amazing thing is that the programs that have been all along practicing a balance of relational and systemic approaches have had enormous success engaging those men who go to the program. We're talking about 80 or 90% of participants are showing up, quote unquote, voluntarily, right? Without any kind of coercion. So some of us, and I know you're in this camp, have known that this is possible because there are programs in the US that have operated in that way without a court mandate, and certainly in the rest of the world, many countries have used programs where there's no court mandate, and they have been able to engage men to come to the program. So this idea, this paradigm that the only way to operate these programs is by mandate from the court or child welfare is starting to crumble, in my opinion. So that's one of the central themes of the article. Is like, wow, what an opportunity to look at other ways to engage people who use violence.
Fantastic. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more, Juan Carlos, about what that relational part of the approach to working with abusive partners is.
Absolutely. It's interesting because it comes a little bit, in my opinion, from where do we come from when we see men who use violence. When I do trainings, I usually start with an exercise in which I ask people to tell me about their fears to work with men who use violence. And then I ask them about their hopes. And this gives me, like, it's a barometer to understand how the group is going. And some people look at people who use violence as monsters, as none that they cannot change, that they deserve to be punished, right? And not only practitioners, a part of society does that. Some other people see them as humans with flaws and also with strengths that possibly can change. And I think balancing these two things, I'm not advocating for a Pollyannic kind of approach to working with men who use violence. We're talking about dangerous situations sometimes. However, I think a balance between what traditionally we have called accountability, which in our field has a lot to do with punishments, right? But for me, it's more like consequences, which could be legal consequence or natural consequences, right? In life, your partner leaves, your children will not talk to you for the rest of your life, or you end up in jail. So there's that part. But the relational part is connecting with the humanity of this other person and believing that this person can change and supporting that process of change. And there's many ways to do that. There's not only one way. If there was a formula, I think we wouldn't be talking here, right? We would have solved the problem. But I'm talking about, for instance, work that I think you and Fernando and others have done, for instance, fatherhood, using fatherhood as a leading strategy to invite men to reflect about the consequences of their violence on their children and motivating them to change. To use culture, for instance, to work with alternative cultural models and values that come from within the culture. Having a trauma-informed approach, that's an interesting one because we hear trauma-informed all over the place now, except with working with men who use violence. Very few people, this is changing, but very few people have had an approach that, this is a highly traumatized population, right? So what does that mean to take that into consideration, not as a justification, but as a way to work with them and help them change, right? So there's various ways and various approaches that people have used. A holistic approach, a couple of programs in particular, the House of Ruth in Baltimore is starting to do what they call wraparound services, which is not only about the program where men go to some people would say be re-educated about their ideology, and that will create change. It's also about helping them find employment, education, food right now, right? That's a big one right now. So seeing medical needs. So seeing them as full human beings that need full support. And that kind of relational approach, in my opinion, and I think there's now research that is backing that, is what gives us a better chance to invite change in people who use violence.
Thank you very much. It's one of the things that excite me about how you think about this issue and the piece that you put together right now is that you are turning a situation of considerable distress in our lives, and you're taking it as an opportunity to rethink, the tenets and some of the ways in which we aspire to help abusive partners. So I think it's an example of resilience in a sense on your part, but it's also I think it's a good moment to think about precisely that, because business as usual is not how things are going to continue to operate. So in a sense, you're helping us move into this post-pandemic time and giving us a glimpse of what it may look like. I was very, very intrigued by the mention on your piece of the work being done by Respect, the nonprofit Respect. I believe it's in Europe, right? And
it's in Britain, yeah.
If you can tell us about that and what they've done in regards to
this. So that's also very interesting because, and going back to your comment before, I think it would be a tragedy if we come out of this pandemic and things go back to the way that they were before, right? In every aspect of our life, this is an enormous opportunity. And one of my favorite questions that I ask in different settings is, especially with practitioners, what would you like to keep from what you are doing right now as you move along, right? And what do you want to let go of the old reality? And you're right. For me, this is an extraordinary opportunity. So I have been hearing from various people in different states this idea that, oh my gosh, I wish we had a hotline or a helpline for men who use violence right now, right? We need that desperately. And it's interesting because some people have been talking about that for a while. And again, I think partly because of political and ideological issues, we just don't have something like that in the US. We do have a hotline, or many, many hotlines for victims and survivors, which are absolutely essential. But we don't have one for people who use violence. Britain, however, does have one and has had one for a few years. This organization called Respect. You can look it up. And it has proved, I think, very effective in a function of, in some way, containing and helping people, right? It's not, obviously, a hotline will not create deep transformation in someone. But if someone is in crisis and someone needs a respite, like any other hotline, like a suicide hotline or a mental health hotline, right? To talk to someone at that time, someone who is an expert, who can help that person de-escalate, reflect, regulate, and from there, hopefully engage them to make a referral maybe for a program or something like that. I think there's such need for something like that. And this is exactly what this hotline in Britain does. And what I mentioned in the article is I heard from the executive director that their calls have doubled since the beginning of COVID-19, and that they also have a chat kind of functions and email, and that like written kind of help has tripled since. So again, I think another paradigm that is related with the one that I mentioned before that we have in this country is that men who use violence will not seek help unless they are mandated to do something. And you know, as a researcher, and there's other research around that's actually not true. That if you give the opportunity to people who use violence to seek help, some will. Of course, not everybody will, but some will. The problem, I think, in the US is that we only have had a system of referrals that are based on coercive systems. We don't have a healthy system of, for instance, therapists referring people to battering intervention programs, or medical personnel, or faith leaders, or other ways. But I think opening those avenues, as well as this idea of a hotline, I think are again a great opportunity to start doing a different kind of business here.
No, certainly, that sounds like something that is needed. We had talked in sidebar conversations that the Institute, the Melissa Institute, would be very, very happy to be involved in an effort that could lead to provide resources like that to abusive partners across the nation. And
hopefully we can make it happen together.
Yes. Now I want to ask you. So this, given what you've seen and what as opportunities as well as limitations of what is happening right now, what are some concrete recommendations that you may have for people who are, both for providers and for those who are at home right now?
Yeah, I think we cover some of the recommendations that I talk about in the article. I think this is an opportunity to start looking at how to work with people who use violence outside criminal justice systems, or in addition to, right? Because of course we need some kind of social controls, but there's other ways, and this is not completely new. There's people that have been practicing community accountability, and people can look that up. It's very interesting. Or things like restorative justice or transformative justice, which are all of this, by the way, and at the forefront of all the work that we do. The voices of survivors have to be leading us, right? I know you and you know me, but I want to make it explicit. We're not talking about doing anything that would further hurt or victimize survivors, right? So we have to be led by that. And by the way, Futures Without Violence, the organization I've worked for, it's a national nonprofit that's primarily develops policy, training, and materials for survivors of domestic violence. We just have a small part where we work with people who use violence. So I think it's an opportunity to look at alternatives to the criminal justice system and the child welfare system on how to engage people who use violence. I think it's an opportunity to seriously think about developing a hotline. And by the way, one thing that I didn't mention before is the national hotline, National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is primarily for victims and survivors, also receives calls from people who use violence asking for help. And I'm not sure if that has gone up, but it's a significant percentage. So there's some precedent on that. But the other side of the coin here, Etiony, and you know this better than me because I have heard you talk very eloquently about this, is that we have put this enormous burden on programs for people who use violence, usually called battering intervention programs. But there's hardly any money to support these programs. The great majority of these programs depend on what we call fee for service, right? The fees of participants to survive. And I worked and was the director of one of those programs in Massachusetts for more than 10 years. And we could barely make ends meet. We had to do all kinds of fundraising. We're talking, very, very little money. And one of the concerns I have right now is that given the situation, some programs are operating on a voluntary payment basis. Many of the men who go to these programs are low-income men who might have lost their jobs, right? So, for instance, I just received an email from a person, I'm trying to remember, somewhere in the South, who has been operating this program for a while. And she was telling me that last week they did 4 virtual groups and they received $200 in donations, so $50 per group. So we're talking about 2 professional facilitators, right, for 2 hours, whatever overhead, preparation, 50. I mean, it's impossible. Programs will not be able to survive if we don't have a real good debate about how to support them. So part of what I call in that article is to really look at federal and state funding streams to support programs for people who use violence. And I know this is controversial. This is the most controversial part of the article. I think in the domestic violence movement, there has always been a feeling that any money that goes to programs for people who use violence would be taken away from victim services. And of course, we're totally opposed to that. We don't want it to come from there. However, I don't think it's a zero-sum game here. There's a lot of money right now going around. And finally, I believe that programs that work with people who use violence are programs that work for victim safety, right? And survivor safety. That's most of the ones I know. That is their goal, right? So we're working towards the same goal. So we need to really have a good debate about how to support these programs, or they will disappear. That's what will happen by inaction, right? So it's not only that I'm asking for us to reflect on how we are approaching this philosophically, but also practically and from a policy point of view. How are we going to, if we're serious about these programs, how are we going to support them as well as the hotline?
One of the things that I mentioned this to you before in an earlier conversation that attract me about this way of thinking is that I believe we need to do everything we can to make violence prevention an important part of our plans to deal with the COVID pandemic and what's coming
Absolutely.
next. It cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be
right.
part of what we're doing from the beginning, because otherwise we are going to be creating the conditions for other pandemics to occur.
Exactly.
And so we have an opportunity now here to be basically thinking ahead with foresight into what is coming and how to prevent it. And we have the technology, we have the science,
yeah.
the know-how to do it. And I really appreciate what you're doing, Juan Carlos. I appreciate our friendship for over 20 some years now. And
Yes.
looking forward for the Melissa Institute on Futures Without Violence to collaborate in some of these new opportunities and ways to shape violence prevention in this country. Thank you very much. Right.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for your work.